Ben's first time reading for us this morning. Yeah, awesome. And I gave him a really great story to read about talking donkeys, right? Yeah, so we're going to talk about that this morning. But as Jeff said, this series, and we had the first one last week, so if you missed it, I encourage you to go back and watch last week's sermon. It's on our YouTube page. You can check that out. This is a little different summer series. We're looking at some different kinds of stories. That's one of the weird stories in the Bible. We're going to talk about that. But I have another story to tell you, a fable, if you will, that maybe will have some resonance with you this morning as we talk about families, and particularly as we talk this morning about dealing with what we might call the terminally touchy in our midst. So you ready for story time with Pastor Bob? Here it comes. When little John was about a year old, his parents noticed very thin fibers protruding through his pores. After a few months, the fibers had extended themselves and began to form curls. The condition was alarming to his parents, so they took little John to the doctor, and the physician announced that little John was unique in all of medical history because, you see, his ganglia, or his nerves, were growing outside of his body. Since little John was otherwise in excellent health, it was decided to do nothing for a while but observe. The doctors told the parents that they must be super sensitive to his every move and touch. Because you see, with nerves outside your body, you could get hurt very easily. Being sensitive people anyway, his parents readily agreed to treat him with special care. As little John grew, so did his nerves until they trailed about him as he walked. And that was not a pretty sight, but surprisingly, it turned out to have some advantages. He learned from the very beginning, for example, first from his overconcerned parents and then from others, that he could always count on someone watching out for him. Indeed, he learned early in his life that anyone who came near him would always pay attention to his every move for fear of hurting him. He found that he could plow a path through any group of friends just by walking toward them. People would always retreat at his advance for fear of stepping on his feelings. Sometimes he encountered people who had not been forewarned about his condition, and then he had to point it out early in their relationship. And once they understood, however, they never tried to get in his way. All of this is not to say, though, that the individuals never felt resentment toward little John. They just never spoke it out loud. All managed to quiet their resentment with self-recriminations about their own insensitivity. And so it went. Little John graduated high school. He obtained a secure job. One day he met a woman that he liked. Being extremely shy, she was thrilled at the advance of this very attentive, if somewhat strange, creature. She treated him with the utmost care, and her pity for him soon became love. Everywhere they went, she watched out for him. In time, the guiding principle of her life became, how can I help this man avoid pain? But after they'd been married for a while, she began to tire. Still, she tried, for this poor man could not help himself, but it became increasingly difficult for her to constantly be mindful of his needs. She decided to confess her increasing insensitivity to her friends. She mentioned it to her family, to her minister, to her doctor. She sought professional help. All comforted her and sympathized with her, but they could offer little advice, so they just urged her to be more patient. And she tried, but soon her health began to suffer. She got headaches. She couldn't sleep. She started to lose weight. She felt anxious most of the time. She dared not tell John, of course, for fear of hurting him. Why, if he knew that all of this was due to his condition, he would be inconsolable. Now, let me pause there for a minute. If you're little John's wife, what are you going to do? She's in quite a bind. What would you tell her? See, the thing is, in every family or organizational system, one of the primary dysfunctions centers around the insensitivities of the sensitive, or as I heard it put once, the tyranny of the touchy. There is a person or persons around whom everyone else tiptoes in an effort to avoid pain and conflict. The result is that, like little John, the system adapts itself around the most sensitive member. In some families, this goes something like this. We must avoid making mom or dad angry. It's going to be bad for everybody. We can't ask Dave to do that job at work because he'll blow up. We don't say anything at the meeting because we don't want to risk offending anyone. Just like the story of the bridge last week, in which we learned how we give power to the needy persons in a family system. In this case, all the power is given over to the touchy one. Why does this happen? What can we do about it? One thing we have to understand is that in any given system of human relationships, there's a lot of anxiety. Anxiety that may or may not be dependent on circumstances, but that always finds its way to the surface in relationships between people. When people are anxious, that anxiety presents itself in a lot of different ways. It manifests itself often in anger, like Balaam in our Old Testament lesson. Balaam knew that God had told him to go with the princes of Moab, but the problem was that God knew that Balaam's motivation was selfish. Balaam had been hired by the princes of Moab to prophesy against Israel. So Balaam's going along, but he's going along because he's going to get paid for saying some bad stuff about God's people. And this makes God angry. So Balaam knows he's at odds with God, and that's causing him anxiety. So when the donkey sees the angel that Balaam doesn't see and veers off the road, Balaam beats her. She's making him look bad. He's got anxiety. It's not about the donkey, it's about what's going on with him. So anxious is Balaam that after the third time this happens, the donkey turns and speaks to Balaam. Now notice his response. His response is not, "My donkey is talking to me." No, it's an anxious response. Listen to how he phrases it. "You have made a fool of me. If I had a sword in my hand, I'd kill you right now. You have made a fool of me." It's all about him. See, Balaam's anxiety isn't about the donkey, it's about himself and about the fact that he's in the wrong. The sensitive, the touchy, the anxious among us often seek to beat up others to get their way because they don't know how to manage their own anxiety. This is the root of most bullying. We see it in the schoolyard, we see it in the boardroom. People don't know how to deal with their own anxiety, their own feelings. Little John, expected everyone else to manage his anxiety, to make everything better. The problem is things can never be good enough for the terminally touchy. I once had a young woman in one of my churches who came to me very distraught. And she talked about the fact that when her mother-in-law would show up at the house, the anxiety in the house went through the roof. Because this mother-in-law would come to the house and she would passively aggressively insult her daughter-in-law during the whole visit. The sheets on the bed weren't good enough, the towels were substandard, the cooking was inadequate, wasn't raising the children the right way, and so on and so on. And so the daughter-in-law comes to me and she's teary-eyed, she's stressed out, you can see it, she's kind of twitchy, and her husband and his father react the way that they always have when this happens. They say nothing. They're silent because they know not to tick mom off. Everybody now has mom's anxiety. Visits are always Maylocks moments. Does this sound familiar to any of you? Here's some nervous laughter out there. Well, here's the thing. Anxiety begets reactivity, which begets more anxiety. When someone attacks you verbally, you naturally want to react, whether it's by arguing back or by shutting down. When we react, we take on the pain and anxiety of the other, and we become anxious ourselves. That happens because we immediately go to the most primitive part of our brain. Brain sciences says that our brain is divided into three parts. You have the primitive, or what we might call the reptilian part of the brain. the middle part where our emotions are housed. You know, and then you've got another part where your feelings are, and then you've got the top part, which is the cortex, where we do our rational thinking. Now, that reptilian part of the brain is about fight or flight. We want to either eliminate the problem or we want to run away from it. It's that quick reaction. But the reality is that the more we try to deal with the anxiety of someone else, the more miserable we become. When the lizard is speaking, either fight or flight, things get out of control. And I've come to realize this is a huge issue in families and in churches. When anxiety drives a system, the most sensitive people always get their way because everyone else is supposed to stand back and be nice, right? We love nice. We like to be nice. Nice people doing nice things for other nice people. That's what church is supposed to be, right? Here's the thing. Look up the word nice in your concordance. You ain't going to find it in the Bible. It's not about niceness. It's not about making everybody upset either. But it's about responsibility. We don't want to get anyone upset, so when the touchy person doesn't like something, they simply apply the 3 O's, and everybody reacts to that. They'll say things like, I'm outraged, I'm offended, and I'm out of here. And everybody caves in. Oh, they may mutter under their breath about how maddening the other person is, but they'll never confront them. In other words, the reptile always wins. All of your interactions become like Jurassic Park. How do we break that cycle? How do we deal with the insensitivities of the sensitive? Well, remember what we talked about last week. Remember, the only person you have control over is you. You're responsible for your own anxiety, and you are responsible for your own reactivity to the anxiety of another. Here's how the brain helps us by being differentiated from the rest of the body. We don't have to react instinctively with the lizard part of our brain, with fight or flight. Rather, we can intentionally move to the thinking part, the top part of our brain, and realize that we can and must choose our own reactions to the people around us. Rather than react, we need to learn how to respond. We need to push the lizard back down where he belongs. You can choose a different way. And in doing so, you can be a non-anxious presence. A non-anxious, self-differentiated person doesn't get trapped by the touchy. They realize that when someone is reactive to them, that it's not about me. It's about the other person's anxiety. If a touchy person bursts into your office to yell at you for some minor infraction, or a parent terrorizes everyone in the house with their anger, you have to realize that for the most part, it's not about you. It's about what's going on in that person's life. It's about their own anxiety. You can choose to make it your own, or you can choose to give it back to them. You can learn to be comfortable with the pain of the other. Even donkeys do this, at least the one in our Old Testament story. Notice the donkey's reaction to Balaam's fury. This is one self-differentiated donkey. So rather than bucking Balaam off or running for her life, she turns to him, imagine this, and she says, "Am I not your own donkey? Have I been in the habit of doing this to you?" Non-anxious response. Balaam immediately feels a little sheepish and says, "Well, no." The donkey knows it's not about her. And she refuses to be bowed by Balaam's anxiety. She takes a stand in a non-anxious way. Which begs the question, who's the real donkey in this story? Now go back to the mother-in-law situation I described earlier. I talked to this young woman about all of this family systems. I said to her, what if you went back and instead of reacting to your mother-in-law, you decided to respond, to be non-anxious, and to take the initiative? So when your mother-in-law starts in on you, you could turn to her and say, in a non-anxious, calm way, I see you're upset. I notice that when you're here, nothing seems to be right. But I want to tell you, I don't believe I'm doing anything wrong. I'm pretty happy with the way things are here. And if you don't like the way my house is run, you have a choice. You can be free to leave. I won't be offended, but the choice is yours. I, however, choose not to be treated in this way. Now, you're looking at me like she looked at me. I could never do that. I could never do that. Sounds great, but it's impossible. Is it? Actually, she took my advice. And a couple weeks later, she came back and said, I can't believe it, but it worked. She didn't leave, but she stopped criticizing. And you could see her face, this young woman's face, relieved of stress. She'd taken a non-anxious, self-differentiated stand, and it changed the system. When we get caught up in our own anxiety, we can't imagine doing something like that. But if we learn to think in a self-differentiated way, we learn that there are alternatives. Reverend Bill Selby, who was one of my mentors, one of my teachers in this whole systems theory, calls this moving toward the roar. We move toward our anxiety and we deal with it rather than running away from it. And when we move toward the touchy in a non-anxious way, we begin to see the system change. But we have to choose to do so. Okay, back to the story. One day, as Little John's wife was walking home from the therapist, where she went every week, she chanced upon a mother cat and her newborn kittens. As they scrambled over one another in their thirst, the mother carefully guided each one to its turn, stretching out a firm but gentle paw to keep it fair. Then John's wife noticed that one of the kittens had been born lame. Its leg was not fully formed. Strangely, it was the most aggressive. While the other kittens who had earlier eaten and were satisfied and fell asleep, this one kept coming back for more, trying to push its way in for more than its fair share. Each time, however, the mother cat pushed it away, at first gently, but then with successively harder whacks. Little John's wife watched this poor kitty and the inhuman mother. But when she returned home upon finding her husband reading in a room, she planted herself in the doorway and began to stare. A little while later, John, desiring to enter another room, marched straight for the doorway that framed his wife. But she did not budge. Closer he came, closer, never thinking to ask her to move. After all, he had never had to ask anyone to get out of his way before. Suddenly he stopped, confused. What should he do? First, he assumed his most wounded look. Then he tried one that was more winsome and boyish. But his wife was like a rock. In desperation, he finally spoke. Move. You know I cannot squeeze by. Nothing. What's the matter with you? He yelled. Then she began to move. Not aside, however, but directly toward him. He retreated. She continued on. He moved back faster. But still on she came. Soon he was cornered. Have you lost your mind? He said, incredulous, which means he found it hard to believe what his wife was doing. She might have found it hard to believe herself. Careful there, you almost hurt me, he said, and that did it. She raised a foot and with a stomp came down hard on one of his long, trailing nerve endings. He screeched more from shock than pain. Again, she stomped. Again and again. He ran past her, but she pursued. She continued chasing him from room to room, up and down the stairs, to the cellar, to the attic, through the kitchen, to their bedroom, until they both finally fell asleep, exhausted. After some hours, when Little John's wife awoke, her headache was gone. She felt great. For the first time in a very long time, she was without pain. She felt relaxed. But more astonishing still was what she saw beside her. For when she looked over at John, she found that his ganglia were no longer curled around him. They had disappeared altogether. In fact, they had completely recoiled inside of his skin. Anxiety will always reign until we decide to move toward the roar and choose to be healthy ourselves. Now, this isn't easy to do, at least at first. Nobody likes tension and anxiety. Nobody likes difficult conversations. But when we realize that we can choose not to take on anxiety, when we can learn to allow others to manage their own pain, we begin to see change in ourselves and in our relationships. Nowadays, for example, when I know I'm going to be in a contentious meeting or something like that, I always have a notebook with me. Sometimes I'll write at the top of the page, NAP. And people will see my notebook and they'll say, well, are you planning a nap later? Sure. But that's not what this stands for. It stands for non-anxious presence. It's a reminder that's my role. That's what I'm shooting for. Somebody sends me a nasty email or leaves an angry message, like some of you are thinking about composing after this sermon. I don't have to respond right away. I have to give myself time to think through my anxiety, to move from the lizard to the cortex. It also helps to know where your own hot buttons are, where my own reactivity and anxiety comes from. But if I know that, I can be prepared. I have to believe that I have the ability to choose how I'm going to respond in any given situation. I have to choose to be ruled not by the touchy. It's not easy. Sometimes we still get reactive, but it's important to know that it doesn't have to be this way. You don't have to live with that status quo. You and I are responsible for our own feelings. Even God doesn't take on all of our anxiety. Jesus is a prime example of this. Notice how many times in the Gospels, people are angry with Jesus. They want to pick up rocks to stone him. They're yelling at him. In his trial, they're giving all kinds of false accusations. How does Jesus respond? Non-anxious. God doesn't take on all of our anxiety. You know, I don't know if you've prayed this way, but I spent a lot of time in my life praying for God to take away my anxiety or to take away the hostility of the person I'm dealing with. Lord, change their mind. You ever prayed that prayer? But you know, I believe God deals with our anxiety by giving it back to us and inviting us to move toward it. God loves us by not bailing us out all the time. He gives us back responsibility for our lives. So rather than praying for God to change someone else, I've now learned to ask, God, show me what's going on inside of me that makes me want to react in an anxious way. Show me how to manage myself. That's a prayer that seems to always get answered, but usually the hard way. Think about your own relationships, about the anxiety you feel when a certain person walks in the room, or the stress that you take on because of unresolved touchiness in your family or your workplace. What would happen if you moved toward it instead of running away from it? What would happen if you decided today to give that anxiety back? What would happen if you said to that person who's giving you grief, I see that you're upset. I wonder what you're going to do with that. Think it's difficult? Think it's impossible? Well, just remember, even a donkey can do it.